Hello. One of the problems with ending a book on a cliffhanger is that you've just ended a book on a cliffhanger. Even though you know your publisher has signed book 2 and it will be coming out, you don't know if your readers will A, forgive you, and B, follow you to the second book. I really appreciate you listening all the way through the Skylark song. So, as a reward for that, and as an apology for that cliffhanger ending, I'm going to read you the first chapter of the Skylark's Sacrifice, which is book 2 in the Skylark Saga duology. You ready? The wind on her face was exhilarating, and Robin was intensely thankful for the amber lenses of Al's goggles. Grit from the street below blew up in her face, and she had to keep reminding herself not to smile, or she'd be eating the rutting stuff. It tasted awful. My belly might be full for once, though, she thought briefly, and then rolled her eyes at the ridiculous notion. Right, and maybe you need to sleep more too, Captain. The wind whipped her fringe into view, and Robin spared a quick second to adjust the scarf wound around the bottom of her face. Made from the remains of her sapphire gown, it kept her ghostly braid bound back, with the coyote's hairpin to hold it closed. Yet tendrils kept escaping out the sides, and every time the lock of white hair flickered across the lenses of her goggles, she had to remind herself that it was her own, and to not be surprised. It had begun to grow back, at least. Short, scrubby hair now covered the bald patches left by the shock of the accident that had claimed Al's life. But it was all coming in white. She was still a ghost, but thanks to the coyote's generosity, she was at least a warm ghost. Just one of the sapphire earrings she'd escaped with had yielded enough coin, when she traded it to a back alley jeweler, to rent Robin a room above a tavern. She had nothing else to her name, not even her name, so she hoarded the money carefully and never shopped for supplies. Shop owners could identify their customers, especially one with sealy dark skin and honey brown eyes, even if they never saw her ghost hair. Instead, she stole from laundry lines all over the city, a pair of dark leather trousers, warm socks, leather pilot's gloves, a thick woolen shirt, a felt vest, a tight double-breasted black jacket, and a pair of plain serviceable woolen men's pajamas, and left a flat gold coin pinned to the lines in their place. She didn't dare venture to the markets for food, so she pilfered what she could from the bins behind the tavern and made do without when she couldn't find anything edible to eat that day. She was used to going without. Wings, however, could not. The rocket pack needed fuel if she wanted to stay aloft, and, well, there were plenty of ways to glide into an aeroship base when one was nothing more than a small black speck on a moonless night. She could get the fuel she needed. She could do this. She could do this. Stay in Lylon, and sneak, and scrabble, and sabotage. She could use the rocket pack she had stolen right out from underneath the Klonnish king to disrupt his supply lines, destroy his aeroships, scare his soldiers. She could use it exactly the way he... No, Robin scolded herself. No, he's dead. He helped you, and you killed him. You left him to burn, and he's gone. She had to stop thinking about those final moments in the woods, about the way his eyes had glittered with fear and despair and pride, about the way his kiss, his last kiss, her first kiss, had felt pressed against her mouth. How she missed his constant presence, which was ridiculous. Didn't she used to find it stifling? And how lonely it made her feel to be without it. How homesick she was for her parents, the air patrol, and Al. God, shut up! Pay attention, Captain! She snarled at her reeling mind and aching heart. You can get back home, she promised herself, but only if you stop spinning your thoughts like a drunk honeybee and pay attention. Robin forced her gaze to the horizon. She was flying high enough above the sliver of countryside that separated the outer slums of Lylon and the first of the tall wire fences that encircled the munitions factory to the south of the city, that she should be utterly invisible to the watchmen. She let herself glide in a circle on the updraft, breathing deep to clear her mind. She had to squint to see the refinery through the hazy night sky, the smog from the stacks leaving off the smelting gallery thick in the air. But she drifted over this same handful of buildings nightly for at least a week. She had the guards' routes memorized, knew the buildings and what they each were housing, and had sussed out the best approach, even in the dark. Tonight was the new moon. The sky was as lightless as it was going to get, and the talk she had gleaned from between the floorboards of the soldier-favored tavern below her little secret garret room had made it clear that there was a large shipment of aeroship fuel amassed here, ready for deployment to the front. It was literally now or never. The only thing holding her back was her. A light frosting of snow made the footing slippery and the landing precarious. Robin skidded a little as wings cut out, the weight of the pack tipping her onto her heels without the thrust to counter it. She wheeled her arms once before her feet skidded out from under her in opposite directions, and she landed flat on her arse. A giggle bubbled out of Robin's mouth, and she clamped her hand down on it quickly. Homans, I wasn't this nervous on my first days in mid-flight, she scolded herself. Robin held her palms skyward, praying briefly for luck, and for someone to watch her back. And then, pressing the buttons on the control box carefully, she powered down wings. The pack purred itself into silence. This roof was the last place anyone expected to find a Saskwayan pilot, so naturally, it was empty. Good thing, too, what with that little topple. It would have been embarrassing to die just because she'd slipped. Picking herself up, Robin moved towards what appeared to be an access hatch in the corner. She wasn't entirely sure what she was going to do when she got down inside the building. She had no blueprints, no keys, no idea of what was really going on. But blow it all up wasn't exactly the kind of sophisticated plan that needed a lot of forethought. And what she did know was that, in the 2 months since she'd resolved to use the Klonn King's prize against his own military, she had promised both herself and the gods one thing. She would only aim at machines. She refused to be responsible for the tears of any more Klonn widows and orphans. She had seen enough of that kind of agony. She'd lived it. Robin had spent those first few weeks, or nights rather, up in the air, getting the feel of wings, and spying on the bases and munitions factories within a few hours' flying distance. Never going so close to the front lines, of course, that the spotlights and anti-aircraft weaponry could find her in their crosshairs. She had no doubt that, even as small and as clothed in dark colors as she was, the attentive soldiers and snipers would be her doom. Klonn defense or Saskwayan, both would be as likely to shoot her out of the sky as they were to ask questions about how she was up there without a glider in the first place. No, staying here, staying hidden, finding a way to make all the pain and the anger and the fighting stop, that was her mission now. The gods had brought wings to her, and one did not reject gifts from the gods. It was unlucky. Not to mention rude. So she had crouched on many a roof, eavesdropping, watching, and learning much about how the Klonn organized their forces. She had sat in the corners of taverns, let her bottom get pinched in her efforts to get close to drunken soldiers with loose lips and a desire to impress any shapely thing willing to thank them for their service. She said little, understanding more and more Klonnish each day as braggarts drenched her brain with their beer-fumed words. She had clung to the sides of buildings and rifled through offices at night, searching for maps and diagrams, anything that she could easily read, feeling grateful for that horrific, long-ago primer in the Klonnish alphabet that he had given her to read in Focus. She had picked this munitions factory as her target specifically because she had observed it was the primary source of the fuel supplied to the monstrous Klonn aeroships. Great truckloads of it left here every day for the base, and Robin was well aware that wings couldn't run for much longer without more fuel. She had good fortune stealing what she needed in dribs and drabs from canisters in the backs of transportation vehicles, but what she really needed was a secret stash of her own. Before that stash was shipped en masse to the front, and the tanks here were left empty for the time it took to refine more. Robin crossed her fingers and brushed away any lingering gods of ill luck, just to be sure. Then she scuttled towards the hatch. The ivory hairpin, along with her small screwdriver, proved useful in picking the lock. She climbed down the ladder, careful not to bang wings against anything on the way in. Omens, she thought, as she was a few steps down the ladder. This place is way bigger than I thought, at least twice the size of the canteen back home. How many aeroships do the Klonn actually have? She ended up on grading high above the factory floor, on a catwalk that ran the expanse of the large building. On either end, a set of rungs had been cemented into the walls, but to her left there was a small observatory, and its walls cut out to allow golden lamplight to spill across the roof. Robin ducked, and when she was sure she hadn't been seen, she crept in the opposite direction. Below her, on the smooth gray floor, rows upon rows of giant copper vats were lined up, filled with fuel just waiting to be decanted into travel canisters. Most had massive bullet-top lids clamped across the wide top of the tub, circular valves holding them shut. There were rows of portholes, though, all at eye level if one was standing on the ground, and behind those portholes lay beautiful amber liquid, bubbling and oh so very explosive. 2 stories up, around the upper edges, they were accessible by more spindly gray grating and ladders. 2 of the vats had their tops open, workers in greasy coveralls peering over the side with dipsticks and clipboards, easy enough to toss some little bit of flame into the fuel. And Robin had brought something a little more significant than a little bit of flame with her. At the end of the catwalk, she found a large brass bell hanging from a thick leather rope. While her Klonnish wasn't great, she did recognize the word for fire. "Perfect," she said. Then she picked it up and rang the demons out of it. The reaction on the floor below was instantaneous. Workers frothed like sea foam to the exits, and the catwalk shook with the pounding beat of a soldier running to see who had rung the bell and why. By the time he got there, Robin had used a controlled fall and wings to get down to the factory floor, and was huddled in the shadows of some sort of hideously noisy machine that seemed to be used to push fuel from one vat to another. She watched the soldier peer around the catwalk and, when he found no one, glare suspiciously at the bell. Eventually, he returned to the ground, following the last of the workers out. When it sounded as if the place was mostly empty, Robin stood and looked around. Shelves of massive round fuel storage cylinders lined the walls by the loading bay doors. Keeping to the shadows, but moving as swiftly as she was able, Robin went over to study them. There was no way, even with wings, that she would be able to take a whole cylinder. It was twice her height and the same width. The pack would never have enough thrust for her to lift with it, and she wouldn't be strong enough to hold on, even if it did. Omens, she thought. These are a lot bigger than I thought close up. I can't just grab one and go like I planned. The first shout came from the front of the factory just as Robin spotted the cheap metal pot resting on a thin metal tripod. The lid was held on with clamps that gave when Robin pried at the levers, and it was just big enough that Robin could have curled up and hidden inside it if she didn't have wings on. Filled with water, it had a spigot at the bottom that told Robin it was probably used as a refreshment station for the folks who worked back here where there was little air. Carefully turning over the pot, she poured out the water, dried the inside with the ends of her scarf, made sure the spigot was tightly closed, and then turned to the giant fuel cylinder. Like the vats, the top of the transportation cylinder tapered into a point with a circular valve. From what she'd seen peering through the fence of the Klonn air base, there was some sort of hose that was supposed to connect to the valve, and the cylinder was tipped upside down to glug like a wine bottle tipped on its end into the tanks of the aeroships. Robin had no hose, nor the rigging contraption to safely tip over the cylinders. The shouting and the sounds of footsteps were getting closer. A man on one side of the factory shouted, "Nema!" He was answered by another in the middle, and another on the far side. They were doing a sweep for fire, Robin realized, and all too soon they would find something else. With no other alternative, Robin whispered, "Gods protect me," and gave the nearest cylinder a shove with her shoulder. It wobbled and then fell. Robin skittered back, fearing the thing might explode. Instead, it merely rolled, knocking into its compatriots and sending them toppling like dominoes. The noise attracted the attention of the Klonn. She was running out of time. She dragged the metal pot over to the cylinder, opened the valve, and jumped back just in time to avoid getting soaked in aircraft fuel. On its side, the majority of the fuel remained in the cylinder, gravity keeping it from being able to flow away, but enough did escape that it filled the metal pot and overflowed into an amber river. The air filled with fumes. Gingerly, Robin picked her way around the puddles, clamped the lid onto the pot, and then ripped the end of her scarf off and used it to wipe the sides clean. "Loa!" someone shouted in Klonnish, and Robin turned, dipping the end of the swatch of fabric into the amber puddle. A man stood behind a complex machine, pointing at her through the workings. It would take him a few seconds to scramble under it to reach her, and Robin used that time to pull the metal pot well away from the fuel on the floor. Then she bent down and started the burn on Wings's exhaust. "Get out of here!" she shouted at the man, and then added, "Nema! Nema!" The man froze, eyes going wide, face going white, when he caught sight of the fuel all over the floor and the gently smoking exhaust of wings. "Nema!" he cried too, and then it was too late. Robin dangled the end of her fuel-soaked scarf scrap under wings, and it flared into hot, noxious flames. They licked at her gloves, and she quickly threw it at the nearest puddle. It ignited with a soft whoosh. Fire crawled across the floor. The man screamed and fled. Robin slammed her hand down on the ignition and, clutching the pot tightly, shot into the air. She ducked around the catwalk and burst out of the roof hatch just as the first warning rumble echoed through the factory. Robin slapped the button on the control box for the stabilizing blades with her chin, and they sprang outward with their signature whistle. The musical chord was followed mere seconds later by a resounding boom that shook the sky and threw Robin off course. The space between the factory and the slums was barren, but it also wasn't that wide, especially when someone had the force of an entire factory exploding behind them, radiating out like ripples as the fire consumed each vat in turn, pushing them along like carefully timed detonations of a blasting stick. As the shockwave she was surfing reached the first row of houses, Robin was absurdly glad that none of them seemed to have glass in their windows. No unfortunate bystander would be blinded tonight, at least. That was something. She tumbled through the air until, swinging the pot around to use as a counterbalance, she managed to find her equilibrium, and not a second too late. She pulled up, just barely kept from smashing into the ledge of a roof. Kicking out, she used her toes to push forward over the lip of the gutter, missing a collision with a crumbled window gable. What she didn't manage to avoid, however, was the laundry line. Wings caught on the thick cording, and Robin was unceremoniously whipped around. She dropped the metal pot and frantically swiped at the control box, cutting the thrust and detracting the blades so they wouldn't bend if she fell on them. The pot rolled across the flat roof, but the clamps on the lid held. It came to a stop against the lip of the gable. Robin's prize was safe. Robin herself, though, she was tangled upside down, one foot thrust up in the air like a bird in a net. The ragged end of her braid tickled her nose. The rest of her hair was trapped in a line, tugging painfully at her scalp, and she could feel the end of the ivory hairpin poking against her nape, where the fabric covering her hair had come free. Cording clinched around her ankle, the bad one, goddammit, and pinned the arm with the control box behind the small of her back, her other wrist aloft and her elbow turned painfully. She'd lost one of her gloves somewhere along the way, and the night air nipped at her exposed fingers. She felt, all told, utterly ridiculous. "Omens," she snarled. "Rotting, frozen coal bags!" She tried wriggling, but it only seemed to make the tangle squeeze tighter, pinning her more thoroughly. In the distance, the factory belched great fireballs into the air, lighting up the night like a God's Day celebration and spewing great clouds of smoke and ash. Her worry was temporarily muted by a surge of fierce joy at the sight. "I did it," she thought. Robin Arianhod had successfully flown wings and sabotaged a whole munitions factory, destroying a stockpile of fuel and yet stealing enough for herself at the same time. Her first mission was a complete and perfect success. Except for the part where she was stuck like a pheasant in a snare. Robin sighed, craning her head around, trying to figure out how to get out of this ignoble predicament. She was about to try to jam the control box against her own arse in the hopes of activating the switch that deployed the wing blades, when a voice in the darkness said, "Impressive," in Saskwyan. Thank you again for following along with me as I read the Skylark song and now chapter 1 of the Skylark Sacrifice. You can find both books of the Skylark Saga on my website, www.jmfrey, that's Frey.net, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do consider leaving a review on Goodreads, Amazon, your blog, or anywhere else you like to tell people about books you enjoyed. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Give up when you're down. Fly as long as you can. Sing your song in the sky while you're passing by your challenges. I hear a ship. Why? is raging